Well, I wanted to ask you this one. It said in the bio, the Beulah Rose Prize from Smartish Pace.
Yeah.
Is it Pace or Press?
It's a magazine, yeah.
Okay, Pace.
Smartish Pace, yeah.
Okay, good.
hmm Yeah, it's a really good poetry journal.
Mhm.
Yeah. Um, I was very happy to get in there. The editor's a really nice guy too.
Opal light in my office at the end of January. The room cold, snow blowing sideways through the limbs of the copper beech. I want for a while no bills, to present none, and to owe none. An end to negotiation of duties to client, parent, house, and child, to body and poetry, haggling over cost and benefits, to adding up what is worth what. A poem entitled Friday Afternoon from our guest, Alison Hicks' new book, Homing. Welcome. My name is Charles Carr, and welcome to Philly Loves Poetry, a collaboration between the Moonstone Arts Center of Philadelphia and PhillyCAM. The focus of our program is to give our audience the experience of the rich culture of poetry in the city of Philadelphia and the surrounding community. And tonight we have a beloved local poet artist, Alison Hicks. Alison was awarded the 2021 Birdie Prize from Meadowlark Press for her book, Knowing is a Branching Trail. She has previous collections titled You Who Took the Boat Out and Kiss, a chapbook titled Falling Dreams, and a novella, Love, a Story of Images. Allison's work has appeared in Eclipse, Gargoyle, Permafrost, and Poet Lore. I have to say, her poetry has been in a lot more journals than these four that she's shared with me. Allison was the finalist for the 2021 Beulah Rose Prize from the Smartish Pace, an editor's choice selection for the 2024 Philadelphia Stories National Poetry Prize, and nominated for a Pushcart Prize by Green Hill Literary Lantern, Quartet Journal, and Nude Bruce Review. Allison is the founder of Greater Philadelphia Workshop Studio, which offers community-based writing workshops. So welcome, Allison's great to have you, and great to have you on our new season of Philly Loves Poetry. I believe this is either the 8th or ninth season that we've been on the air, so I'm very grateful to PhillyCAM for continuing this series. So I wanted to start off our conversation, of course, with the title of your of your book, Homing, as a title of the book, and of course it's the titled poem, uh, especially how it, how it goes about describing so much else in the poem. Uh, when I think of homing, that people use that word, I think of homing pigeons, or I think of homing devices that are used in electronic equipment, even homing in military weapons. Uh, but when I went to look up the word in Wikipedia, they interesting had a subheading called topographical memory. And I'll describe what they had under that. Under topographical memory, topographic memory, memory of the contours surrounding the destination, is one common method for navigation. This is mainly used by animals with less intelligence, such as mollusks. Limpets use this to find their way back to the home scrape. Although whether this is true, homing has been disputed. But, taking that description, I don't know, how accurate that is. I guess for me, then the title made a lot more sense when we talk about memory, because there's such a perspective of memory here that come in all of these poems. And I said this is really a great metaphor for the collection. So could you discuss why you selected that title and
Yes.
how it really represents your collection?
Yeah, no, I'm really happy to do that because there is a story about this title. This was not my original title. My original title was Toward Protection of the Colony, and you've read the book, so you know that I have a poem in there, and I will be reading that later under that title. And I was very married to this title, and I sent it out for, well, it was a good 2 years before it got picked up. And at one point, an editor, very nice guy, wrote to me and he said, what do you mean by colony? And I wasn't using it in the sense of colonization in that political kind of sense. I was using it the way you do in natural history, and in terms of, and I was also thinking of it in terms of kind of human colony, the human colony, because I wrote that poem and some others during the pandemic, and what at that point what I felt was that we are threatened. All of humanity's that now there's other things other than COVID-19 that threaten us, and notably climate change. So that fed into it too. But the immediate thing was this sense of that we have to think about protection, and then also more widely about protecting the earth and the other creatures that live on the earth. Um, so, but because so I explained this all to the editor, and he said, "Oh, I get it. That makes so much sense." And I had um, "Toward Protection of the Colony" as the first poem in the book. And I thought that if somebody reads this poem, they're going to understand how I mean it. But, maybe not. It's a loaded word now. And so, that started a little doubt creeping in. And one of my very first readers, who is in a poetry group that that I am in, poet Amy Small McKinney, had said something to me. She and Catherine Bancroft were early readers and on the first draft, and she said something like, I think this is about homing. And I did have the homing sequence of poems in there. But for some reason, I just didn't want to go there. And so I kind of waved that off and sent my thing out. Well, when it was finally picked up, Haley Hogan from Sheila Nagig Editions, who's just wonderful, she sent me, she said, "Look, I'll publish this exactly as it is. But, I want to mention a couple of things, you might want to think about to make this book the best that it can be." And the first thing she said is, "I think the title should be Homing." So I sort of felt at that point it was like, okay, two people have said this, you know, this has got to, and as once I, you know, accepted that, you know, I began seeing, yes, it it does. And I loved your thing about that topographical memory, because, yeah, that feeds in it too. The other thing that's good about the title that maybe was not so good about Toward Protection of the Colony, um, is that it is a word that has a lot of associations and kind of can invite the reader to bring in their own associations. Um, so maybe I thought that, um, you know, I think there's always some resistance. I think, well, I have. I shouldn't talk about all poets, but when somebody asks, you know, what's your book about? And you're like, well, I don't want to answer that question. You just read it, you know. Um, and actually, when I submitted it to Sheila Nagig, you know, I had heard that she really wants a tightly themed collection, and I thought, oh, she's never gonna take this, you know, but I'll try it because I've put it out everywhere else. And so I thought, well, the one thing I could do is kind of write up a little blurb, and maybe she'll buy that, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way I could get myself to do this, because I hate doing that, was to say, okay, well, I'm just drafting this and it doesn't have to make any sense and I don't have to use it. And so I just wrote down some words, some sentences, and then I left them alone. And then I looked at them like about a week later and I thought, oh, that's not bad. And actually, that's a version of that is the summary little thing that's on the back here. Um, so, you know, and there I connected up some of the ideas about homing and about protection toward protection of the colony without quoting it directly. That 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 did really talk about, you know, what I thought this was about. But I like the idea because there is a lot of memory in here. You're absolutely right about that.
You know, I read one of the poems, line, and immediately I thought of this poem that I love by Seamus Heaney. It's called "Digging,"
Yeah.
and where he compares the process of, I think it might be the very first poem published in a collection of it's called North. I'm not sure. But anyway, I've always loved this poem, and I read it a lot, where he compares the process of writing poems to his father and grandfather digging in the bogs for peat, for,
Yeah.
you know, for in Ireland, they use that for heat. And for you, and I went back and I read your poem, and I'll quote it. It says, "Dropping my line, let it out. With its sinker, it goes down where I can't see. You write, I am not looking for fish to catch by the lip. I will take a boot, a tire, whatever the river gives up." So, and I said to myself, well, that is a great description of the process and the struggle, you know, that we as poets go through. Is we don't know what we're going to pull up out of our
Might be a
subconscious.
tire.
It might be a tire, but it might be a real gem. So I just wanted you to talk about that, you know, how you, and again, it comes up in another poem of yours called Swift Valley Elegy, where you write, "The best way to the town is to follow the fish." And later in the poem, you offer a quote: "You can't get to it by thinking. You can't get to it by you can't get to it by grasping." And I found this fascinating. Fascinating. I don't know where that quote comes from, but can you talk about that process, using that in that poem, and how that, you know, might be also another perspective on how you go about your poetry?
Yeah, you know, the quote, you can't get to it but by thinking, you can't get to it by grasping, you can't get to it by not thinking, you can't get to it by not grasping, is from the Heart Sutra. So it's Buddhist. Um, and, you know, in Swift Valley Elegy, which I am going to read later, um, that is about the creation of the Quabbin Reservoir in western Massachusetts, which is, I lived very near there. I grew up very near there. And there were 4 towns that were sunk. And cemeteries dug up. I mean, I went to school actually with some people whose parents and grandparents had lived in those towns. You know, at the time it was the Great Depression. These towns were very small. Boston had a lot of political power, western Massachusetts much less. You know, Boston wanted the water. Yeah, we're going to dam the Swift River. So, and I didn't really think about this very much when I was growing up there, but I ended up, you know, as sometimes thinking about it, it started with thinking about a swimming hole that we called the Pelham Pool. Pelham was the little hill town that lived in, and which was not a pool at all. It was a mountain stream, and it was a little dam. In fact, you walked across this dam to get to a little beach, and water was really cold, very refreshing in the summer, a little bracing, but I knew after I came back from college, I lived at home for a couple of years, and I knew that it wasn't going at that point. And so somehow in my, you know, 60s, I woke up and said, gee, I wonder what happened to the Pelham Pool. And so that started me going back to research it. And in doing that, I, you know, I just really researched the hydrology of the area. We lived within walking distance of 3 reservoirs, which I hiked around, which were for the town of Amherst, and then Quabbin was there. But with all this, I read much more about Quabbin, and now I'm on this Facebook group for Quabbin, which is really great because they have pictures and you know, really interesting things that you learn about this. And suddenly it really struck me what this meant for the people, you know, what sinking and you know, it was, for some people it was work because there was no work and they could work on clearing a land, you know, but some people were very much opposed, and you know, but it was going to happen. And so you cannot get to it by thinking, you cannot get to it by it's kind of that. It's still hard for me to wrap my mind around it, really, you know, to take in what that meant. Now, you know, it's not that many people, but it's enough people to be really interesting. So that's kind of how that came in, and the line poem is kind of connected to another poem that I'm going to read both of them, that is actually set at Tinicum. It's called Field Notebook at Tinicum. Something about once I'd written Field Notebook at Tinicum, which I'll say more about when I write it, I think I wrote line like the next week. And it isn't that I've done any fishing in Tinicum, but just somehow I was thinking about that body of water, and I was thinking about, you know, that was one of the ones that really just came to me. And yeah, I was thinking right away, yeah, this is what I do. And that idea of giving up you know, like, I don't care if I get a fish, I'm going to get a tire or whatever. I think that for me was you know, that's the release. That's the thing that allows something to come. And sometimes that's hard because you really, you know, you don't want that tire. but you have to be kind of willing to say, okay, if I pull up a tire, that's what I'm going to work with.
Yeah, that's interesting. When the things that you mentioned, is I said to myself, okay, you pull up something, and so you're not disappointed that you know, you want to amplify, you know,
Yeah.
what is in your mind about that very, you know,
Right.
if you're talking about a tire, where did that come from, and how you can build in your own experience. You gave an interview that I've read online to Lynn Fanuc, and you said about about poetry. I start with language. When I have an idea for a poem, the idea comes from language or is more attached to it. I get down some language. Sometimes I'm excited and it just seems to happen. Other times I'm dissatisfied for a while, but I keep playing with it. Interesting how language prompts your various images and events. So talk about that. I mean, I think that's a very interesting way. And people say, well, you mean you begin with a word, as opposed to people say, well, I begin with an emotion, or I begin with an image, or I begin with something happened today. But you say, I begin with language. And I think if when one reads your book, one understands where you're coming from with that.
Yeah, I think, it's more that the image or the idea, I can't, it has to come in language. I have to hear some of the language. And when I wrote fiction, I kept coming up with these great ideas for stories, that just wouldn't go anywhere because I couldn't hear the language. I have to hear like the first line, or I have to hear some part of the language. And if I can't do that, I don't know how to make it come into being. It's in here, but I can't bring it onto the page. So, for instance, when I wrote Swift River Valley there, the Swift Valley Elegy, I had this bunch of information that I'd looked up, these facts and figures. But that first line, the way to the towns is to follow the fish. That was the line that unlocked it for me. And, it mainly is the thing that really fascinated me is I watched this documentary, and the river, it's dammed, but the river's still flowing underneath all the water. And the other thing is that the towns basically, as people will do, used the river as a dump. So there's all this stuff that they dumped, and it's stuff that's now like from the the early 20th century, the 19th century. So some of it we don't think of as, the kind of garbage that we would think of today, but it was essentially their garbage. But it's still there underneath, and the river still runs, and the fish go along that river. So if you're fishing, that's where you want to go. So I found that absolutely mind-blowing because I did not know that. So one of the things that one of the ways that poems develop for me is that I kind of have a subject, and I do look things up and I learn things, and then they kind of spark things. So that's, but I do kind of have to hear at least some pieces of, and it's not a word, it usually has to be a phrases or a sentence or a line or something, but it does have to, I have to hear some of the language. And what's interesting about that is now what is happening is a lot of my early drafts are actually not, they're basic, they're kind of prosy. I write around it, and I just see what kind of language. It's like bringing up that tire. I just see kind of what language I can bring up around the subject, and I use my workshops to do this because I write with them. So I write when they're writing too, and so I can get a start on that, and then I look to kind of refine it. And
Yeah, I really like what you say, and I think a lot of people have this process. But what I've come to love about poetry, it's given me an education in words that I think I know the meaning of, but I don't, and that are used a lot, and they might be, and also like science and scientific terms. And I say, you thought it was that, but when you read deeper, and that's part of the beauty of this for me. I mean, I get an education
Yeah.
that perhaps otherwise I wouldn't. Um, the one thing, and we've talked about this, is the form that you use, while I've used the term short form, but what I like about books of poetry that have, kind of a crisp, tight poem.
Mm-hmm.
I,
I do too.
I don't know whether I lose attention when somebody has a 12-part poem, and I'm not insulting the greats because there are people that have
Yeah.
it, but your poems, a number of them are very crisp and compact, and I say to them, wow, you did a lot in that space. And so, can you talk about the use of that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm like you. I like and I um, you know, I have this sometimes with longer poems. I do get kind of impatient, so I like the sort of short form poem myself. So maybe that is part of it. Um, it's interesting what you can get by taking away sometimes, and that's been as I said, I got my MFA in fiction, and I thought I was going to be a novelist. I've published more poetry than I have fiction or nonfiction. Um, and I feel like poetry was always I always wrote poetry. It just, for a long time, it was just not very good. Um, and I feel like poetry is always like tugging at me. But I was like, no, 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 I'm not a poet. But I kept writing it because, would I think it has to do with sound for me, that sound and that language part is so strong that I think that's what really kept me attached to it. And I thought, even if I'm just doing this for myself, I'm going to do it. Um, and I was in the middle of trying to write a novel, and I kind of all these poems started falling out, and I realized I'd made a quantum leap, and that's when I joined Leonard Gontarek's poetry workshop, and from there, I continued to get an education in that kind of compression, but I found, strangely enough, that I really liked it, and I didn't think that I would, and I really like seeing what you can take away and still make this object. The other thing I really liked about with a novel or longer fiction, I always felt it was so nice to have something that I could manipulate words on a page. I could see it all. I could see the whole. Um, and so I really gravitated towards that. And so I started to think, I don't really have an interest in writing novels. Now I have a couple of great ideas, but I don't know. Um, I have gravitated more to those shorter forms and enjoyed what you can do with that.
Yeah, I think I told you, and I have told you, that as I read this and I came up to what I call the finale of the book, those poems were absolutely glorious. And sometimes, I think your book's 85 pages or whatever. Sometimes when you're reading an 85-page book of poems, you start to get a little bit weary toward the end. But this was a different experience. I mean, for me anyway, that it really picked up how you finished with those poems. And I said, you know, that was really genius to do that, because you really kept, whoever's reading. And I read a couple of them. I read and I reread, and I really enjoyed them. So, that was very successful. The way you organized the book that way, and also organized in a way they were, very crisp at the end, but very good. I know you're going to read some of those poems when you read the poems. Alison, what do you hope? And I ask this of, I guess, of every guest. What do you hope that your reader gets from your book and walks away from?
Well, what you got is great. I'll take it. Yeah, I think if somebody can connect with some of the poems, if somebody, I mean, I think beauty's always up there. For I think for any artist, that's not a trivial concern. It's and art has to do also with pushing boundaries of beauty and questioning what is beautiful but it has something to do with making something beautiful. So I think if somebody thought some of these poems were beautiful, I'd be thrilled. If so I want that aesthetic appreciation, but also the connection too. If somebody connects to some of the places that are in this book, or some of the life events that happen, or experiences, if you will, or feelings, I mean, yeah, that's you hope somebody out there, has felt this, and maybe recognizes that. Also, sometimes, like I do, when I'm finding out things, I hope they learn something too, especially when I'm doing more of the natural world poems. I hope they kind of enjoy the discoveries that I've enjoyed. Um, so, yeah, but also if they're able to, as I say, the connection, bringing their own experience to it. I mean, one of the things that is great if you have a work that doesn't just have sort of one very clear interpretation, um, that there are different shades, that people can bring their own experience and their own life and their own reading experience to it, and so it's great when
Yeah.
somebody can do that.
Right. Well, speaking about the experience, we want to have the experience of you reading your poems to our audience, and so very much look forward to that. And time's yours, as they say,
Okay.
to read your poems.
All right. Well, thank you, Charles. Those were great questions, by the way. And whenever you get questions, you're always like, "Oh no, do I know how to answer this?" But then it gets really fun. So I thought I would start off by reading, actually, Toward Protection of the Colony, since that was originally the title poem. Um, and this is really a kind of a wish and a prayer for my son and his generation. He's in his early 20s. Um, okay, well, I'm going to read it. I'll say something else at the end. Toward Protection of the Colony. Let no one tell you you have no home on this earth. Read books and people equally well. Walk streets of cities, hike the back country, paddle lakes and rivers. Lighten your step with discovery, gentle touch. Pick up after yourself. May friction make the experience memorable. Find work you enjoy. If it should pay, don't let that sap the joy. On occasion, lose yourself in it. Gather with friends and strangers without risking your life or theirs. Believe this will happen again in your lifetime. When you dive through the blue, the reef will still be there. And so there's a couple of things I'll just say about this. I had one person who helped me proofread, and that line, "May friction make experience memorable." She said, "Do you mean fiction?" And I said, "No, I actually mean friction." So the other thing is that this was written during the pandemic, when gathering with friends or strangers could risk your life. And the final thing is that my son is now in the Florida Keys. He is working on reef restoration with a group called, with an organization, Reef Renewal USA. So he is diving through the blue to try to make sure the reef will still be there.
Wow, that's exciting. Wow.
Yeah, it's very exciting. All right, so I grew up in Amherst, Massachusetts, Western Massachusetts. My parents were professors at UMass, and Amherst is the town that Emily Dickinson lived in. This is 280 Main Street. I grew up in the town she lived in, was led with school groups to her room, desk, bed with coverlet, white, dress preserved on a standing hanger. The younger boy of the family that occupied the house those days, parts visitors were not allowed to go, was my age. I climbed with him and the girl from across our street to the cupola, where wasps flew lazily above our heads, landing in corners of the glass. The soul acquainted with the fellow in the grass selected her own society, then shut the door. The nobody who wouldn't stop for death and asked if you were, too. Wren's footprints on the backs of bills and envelopes, copied out, folded, bound into fascicles. We were told she loved the children of the town, let down baskets of gingerbread on a rope from her bedroom window, facing Main Street and the Congregational Church. When we moved out of town, I passed her house twice a day, going up and down Pelham Hill. And it was true in those days that the Emily Dickinson house was owned by Amherst College, and they actually they had the parts that they would show, but they had an Amherst College family live in the rest of it, and they the Mudges. There were several of them around my age, and so I actually first knew the house as this place that I would occasionally play in. But I love the idea of the wasps in the cupola because I think she would have loved that. As I said, I grew up in Amherst, but I also spent a lot of time in Northern California because that's where my grandmother lived. She had retired out there, and then my parents retired out there too. So this was California. My grandmother's house had two half doors, Dutch doors they called them. The top unlatched from the bottom, swung open. You could stick your head out, indoors mixing with sun, burning through fog, eucalyptus, damp bricks of the patio. Redwood boxes of fuchsias, little explosions of red, pink, purple. Unable to survive a freeze, I knew, or being brought indoors, I learned, when I hung a basket on our porch for a summer back east. They die without the movement of air across the skin. And for me, those fuchsias seem to represent the difference between California and the East Coast. Okay. One thing about me, some people who know me know that when I was an adolescent, I played the cello, and I was very into it, actually. I ended up stopping in college. I didn't really mean to, but the cello is not the most transportable of instruments, and I was moving around, and, finally, I just didn't play. I started up again after my son began viola lessons, and I sat in his lessons, and I was listening to all this string talk, and it was driving me crazy. I said, I'm going to fix up my cello and start playing again. And I did, and I now play with Orchestra Concordia. We have a concert coming up in May, on May 2nd. We go into rehearsal in March, so I've got some work to do on Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony, which is quite a challenge. But to go back to an earlier time, here is Lessons. Let yourself in, wait in the living room. The cat knows the orange couch shows off his tortoiseshell fur. Photo on the wall, your teacher laughing in a canoe. When she calls, pick up your instrument. Grand piano, window, two chairs facing the bookcase. She on the right, you on the left. Where to put your fingers, how to move the bow. Her voice and the cello sound. She writes instructions for practice in a clear hand. You can never be her, but if you could choose to spend your life inside this room, you would. And this is kind of a follow-up poem to that. The French call it l'âme. They brought the cellos out, one after another, standing over me, correcting my accidentals. I chose the one with dark varnish, hairline scars on the top, book matched back. I set it in its case in the cold car while we went to dinner before the long ride home. In the morning, I lifted it across my knees. Something solid rolled down inside. In tears, I called my teacher to confess I'd broken it. She sent me to a man who slipped an S-shaped tool through the F-hole, grabbed the loose soundpost with a sharp-pointed star, set it underneath the bridge, ends flush against top and back, then repositioned, searching for the place the soul would sound. And the French word l'âme means soul, is translated as soul, but it is also their word for the soundpost. That's another thing that I love. I learned. Okay, let's see. All right, here we go. Here's Swift Valley Elegy, which I've already talked a lot about. The best way to the towns is to follow the fish. Underneath the reservoir, the river flows in its old bed. 70 feet down, dumps along its bank, eroded, bottles, crockery, iron machinery from the turn of the 20th century. Mussels, sponges, polychaete worms, survivals from the lakes the valley was known for. The rest barren as when they finished clearing some 80 years ago. Dana, Enfield, Prescott, Greenwich. The present floods the past runs in its veins. You cannot get to it by thinking. You cannot get to it by grasping. The clearing took 12 years. At the depth of the Great Depression, men came in from Ware and Springfield, tore down buildings, pulled up tracks, removed bodies from 34 cemeteries. The valley on fire for months. Enfield held a ball, played Auld Lang Syne, dissolved at midnight. Inundation took 7 years. 29 square miles covered by 412 billion gallons. 2,500 exiled. You cannot get to it by not thinking. You cannot get to it by not grasping. Old roads lead into water. Their paths can be traced from the air. And it is true. You can see roads. They just end. Okay, this is swing. My father made me a swing in the upper meadow above the stone wall, below the edge of the woods. He pulled rope that lasted through my childhood, over the limb of a maple, passed the ends through holes in a sanded board, and knotted them. Didn't rot through until I was home from college, trying to figure out how to do what I wanted to do, fit into the inhospitable world that in the end I had to leave home for. Those lonely, uncertain years, I want to toss as far away as I can. My son carries back, dog with a stick in its mouth, wagging its tail, nudging my leg to make me throw again. All right. And here, ta-da-ta-da, is Field Notebook at Tinicum. And I don't have to explain to this audience where Tinicum is or what it is. It's great. I could have used the set of traveling colors, the brush with its barrel of water, winter hues, ice-covered shallows, dry stalks, ragged heads of phragmites, sparrows that flew back and forth in the grove. Plank bridge across the neck where ice gives way to deeper water. Quiet, considering the highway, the train tracks, the airport. Walking here after the drop-off. Squares of color arrayed, shifting with sunset. Paper holding the rinse. And this poem is very close to my heart because when my son was in college at University of Colorado Boulder and we put him on the plane back to Denver, we realized that we could bring the dog along, drop him off, and then go walking at Tinicum. And I mentioned the set of traveling colors, and one of his study abroads was in the Galapagos and Ecuador, and it was great. They didn't bring any laptops. Their project for this was to create a field notebook, and he had this little set of watercolors and a little brush, and I just love that. And he made a really beautiful field notebook. So I say this is my field notebook. But I wrote this, we dropped him off, and I was missing him. All right, Nightscape. There were dogs and stars in the silence. Strange thing. Dogs running, stretching front legs, claws eating up earth, stars popping into the clear night, like Matisse's cutouts. Silhouettes of dogs in black. I followed them over frozen ground. It seemed important to convey, stars and the dogs running, only I didn't have the words. They came afterwards. In the moment, I had the paper, movement of legs, and light from the stars that was in the process of reaching me. Let's see, okay. This is another one that is kind of dear to my heart. It's called Tall Grass. And I wrote this after making the car journey from Philadelphia to Boulder, Colorado, and stopping at Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve in Kansas. And if you ever have a chance to go there, do. It is wonderful. But this is what it inspired for me. Tall grass. I do not believe in an afterlife, but in a journey that carries us from one state of being to another. It happens in the time it takes to draw a breath that might be experienced as months or years. Say we open eyes in tallgrass prairie, like the grasslands in which our species was born. Indian grass, blue stem, switchgrass, rosinweed, coneflower. Bison, prairie dogs, fires sweep through controlling growth of trees. Wind blows us from this soft land into rising dryness, soapwood yucca, plains prickly pear, honey mesquite, shortgrass, blue grama, buffalo grass, hailstorms, blizzards, tornadoes, drought. Asinwadi, seen across the prairies, they look like a rocky mass. Ascend cottonwood to one-seed juniper, ponderosa, Douglas fir, quaking aspen, lodgepole and bristlecone pine, blue spruce. And the Asinwadi is the Cree word for the Rockies, and it's translated roughly as, seen across the prairies, they look like a rocky mass, which is another great thing to discover. Okay, so here is line. I drop my line, let it out, with its sinker. It goes down where I can't see, ripples out from where it drops. I'm not looking for a fish to catch by the lip. I will take a boot, a tire, whatever the river gives up. The bottom cold and still will not tell me the riverbank is silent. I am an interloper. They do not trust me. What have I done to earn their trust? After all, I do not breathe water. I can only sit here with my line, quietly let it float above the depths. Let's see. Okay. Something joyful in the scent. The dog smells rain, wedges himself between the chair and sill, just before a hint of sea, of dill. A COVID-19 survivor returned to the ICU. He stood where his bed had been, remembered the digital clock, the window too, light coming through. Hickory Creek in the Allegheny Forest, I wanted to go back, a place I got lost to figure out the way. Summers in Northern California, only twice made it all the way in, past cold and the breakers, lifted by salt and swayed. And actually, one of the interesting things that has happened to me in my life is that my husband and I and two dogs, a dog 2 dogs ago, were actually lost for 5 days and 5 nights in a Heart's Content area of Allegheny National Forest in western Pennsylvania, which is the smallest wilderness area we've been in. So it was really ridiculous. And we had to be rescued by the state police. We were very glad to get that helicopter. And it's very weird because we must have been within a mile of our camp. We just could not figure it out. And we kept tromping back and forth along the creek and just getting more and more disoriented as we didn't have any food. So finally we decided we really just had to wait for help, and it came. It's also true that all the summers in California, I only got into the water all the way twice. It has to be a really sunny day. Okay, here's another place where I've been in the wilderness, Petawawa. To get from Cedar to Catfish requires 5 portages upstream. From the Brent store dock, the shoreline is unending green. Point straight across, paddle toward the sound. By the waterfall near the end of the second portage, too excited for the path, the child slipped. Was he 6 years old? 7? The branch that caught him, hardly older. We pulled him up, trying not to think of death or injury. On Narrow Bag, a moose stood in the shallows, dipping her nose for pondweed and lily, sodium-rich, baying as her suckling calf butted into her. We floated in a mid-afternoon when it seemed the sun would never move. By the time we put into Catfish, it had set. In near dark, we climbed to a campsite, ate by candle lantern, sitting on a log, the river speaking source to confluence, where it empties into another body, one giving way to another. And this setting, the Petawawa is a river in Canada, and it goes through Algonquin Provincial Park, which is where my husband, my son, and I have done many canoe treks, and this was one of them, and he did indeed slip. He remembers this. It came up one time. He told a teacher about it, and she was like terribly horrified. But if he hadn't been caught by that branch, he would have been dashed against rocks. It really was kind of scary. But as it is, we pulled him up. The branch was there, and we went back many times. He loved it. We want to go back again. Okay. I thought I'm not going to read the whole sequence of the whole sequence from the homing the whole sequence of the homing poems, but I'm going to read the first one, which is Lives of Truffles. And this really explains, I think, the sense of homing that is part of the meaning of the book. Homing, it's called, when fungal hyphae attract other hyphae, fuse and branch to form a spreading, sensing net in the dark under our feet, where we don't care to look, stitching roots and soil together. Fluent in chemicals, mycorrhizal networks have no need of sun. Get sugar from tree roots they must partner with or die. The underground fruit produce scents that rise through earth, penetrate senses of animals who live on the surface, compelling enough to dig up and consume, every bite packed with spores. Through the subterranean mycelium spreads, feeding by touch, exploring, its shifting shape carrying its map and its history, where it's been and where it's going, meeting the world where it is, digesting. And all that information there comes from a wonderful book by Merlin Sheldrake, and I'm going to forget the name of it now. It's like Enchanted Life. What is it? I got to look it up because I have it here. Entangled Life. Entangled Life. And it's really, and it, everything you wanted to know about fungi and mushrooms and more. Okay, I've come to the part where I'm going to basically pretty much with a couple of, I'm going to kind of read straight. I'm going to try not to say too much. And this is sort of in this part of the third section that Charles is talking about. Hope. How we came to it, we did not know. We were a long way from the ocean. We walked for a long time. We could not say why we kept going, lack of alternative possibly. We drank from a deep hole, water cooled in earth. There were tall trees with thick bark. Needles softened our steps, then mountains, snow. We descended to a coast. Fish and fruit were plentiful, and we ate. How we came to any of it less than clear. We told stories that pretended to knowledge. Everything we saw was full of meaning beyond us. This is Bright Angel, and it refers to the Bright Angel Trail in the Grand Canyon. Bright Angel. Lights move all hours of summer nights toward the south rim. Hikers who've forgotten, it takes twice as long to come up. Easy to laugh at fools who don't know when to turn around. A canyon is the reverse of a mountain. The hardest part comes last. Having traveled far to get here, would you stop this close to the river that made the journey through the same rocks over more years than you can grasp? Worth being a fool for? And how eager are you to climb back to your life?
We have about 2 minutes left.
Okay, all right, let me
Excuse me.
Yeah, great. All right, I think I'll do red clay here. I'd like to wake up to mountains, red cliffs, smell of ponderosa, city throwing a net over the valley. Those chased from their lands, their homes, bless them, keep their feet intact. Everyone should have a mountain, snow-peaked or green, a city to call theirs. Let everyone be issued a stamp, a pass, everyone her sea to sail on it.
Wow. Wow. Thank you. And everyone should have an opportunity to read this collection of poems by Alison Hicks, Homing. I would strongly recommend it, whether you're a poetry reader or not. This is a fine collection. So thank you, Alison. Thank you for the discussion. Thank you for the amazing reading of your poems. And I want to say thank you to our technical director tonight, Laura Deitch, for making this broadcast happen live, and to PhillyCAM. Of course, this is just one program of the Moonstone Arts Center collaborations. Just about every Wednesday night at Fergie's Pub, there is a live reading. There's one tomorrow night at Fergie's Pub if you want to come. So if you want to know more about what we are doing, you can go to moonstoneartscenter.org and see all the things that this organization is doing. In addition to publishing, I mean, there's chapbooks, there's anthologies, there's a number of themed anthologies. So I would have to say there's no organization, I don't think, in the country, I know locally, that does as much to promote the love of poetry as Moonstone does. So go there. You can find out, what events are coming up. There is also, if you're a poet, there's a chapbook contest that's run every year, and that's in process at the present time. So you can find more out about that. So now next month, on Philly Loves Poetry, we're going to have another great friend of poetry in this town and this area. That's Natalie Anderson. And we're going to be discussing and reviewing her latest book, a poem called Rough. So you really should tune into that. It'll be really great. So thank you again for watching tonight. And thank you again, Alison, for being our very special guest.
Thank you, Charles.